It was fairly arbitrary. I did a PhD in British and French history. I taught at a small college down in Virginia, got tenure, but because I was born and raised in Washington, I knew about the Foreign Service and I knew something of what diplomats did. For example, in my elementary school class, there was a Swedish kid and a Danish kid, both of whom were sons of diplomats. So in other words, the Foreign Service was always a kind of option that was out there. I decided simply to try the Foreign Service because mobility within academia was extremely limited. I had tenure, so I was perfectly satisfied with my situation. Signed up to take the Foreign Service exam. The night before, I was at a party, which, shall we say, was rather liquid. And when I went to bed, I thought, well, if I wake up in time, I'll go take the Foreign Service exam, and if I don't, I won't. Well, I did, and I did take it, passed, and at that point started seriously considering whether this was something I wanted to do, and concluded that I did. What an American diplomat does is he represents U.S. interests and tries to advance them as defined by whatever administration is in office at the time. That latter point is particularly important, I think, because an administration is in office because the American people put it there. Diplomats have never been elected by anybody to anything. So that what a diplomat must do is adopt internally the goals of the administration and do his best at representing them. This is true even if the diplomat might personally disagree with the particular policy. For example, at the time of the Vietnamese War, some of my colleagues determined that support for the administration's policies was, in fact, something which morally they could not do. In a situation like that, your option is to resign. Your option is not to torpedo the policy that is being advanced by the administration. My fondest memory is the access that being a diplomat provides to absolutely fascinating people. Now, fascinating people in terms of who they are and what they do. For example, I served in Pretoria during the transition to non-racial democracy. And at that particular time, everybody in South Africa wanted to talk to the Americans. And so I actually had the opportunity of talking to Nelson Mandela, F.W. de Klerk, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So at that level, fascinating people. But there are a lot of other fascinating people. For example, when I was serving in Paris, I had the opportunity to meet French academics working on 17th century French history. That was an academic interest of mine. And it was only because I was a diplomat attached to the American embassy that I had the opportunity to interact with them. The list goes on and on of really fascinating people doing really interesting work. a couple of canons, for example, from Coventry Cathedral involved in peace and reconciliation work in Nigeria, who had remarkable insights as to what was going on, both in the Niger Delta, then in the throes of an insurrection, but also in the north, the kind of precursor to what we're seeing now with Boko Haram. It's very interesting, actually. You get used to an extreme climate in about 6 weeks. So, yes, Lagos is kind of like Washington, D.C. in August, only it's year-round. After 6 weeks, you simply don't notice it. So, absent disease, and of course disease now is under control, well, sort of. We've got Ebola. But absent that kind of thing, no, it's not really a challenge. Oh yes, I've known him for a long time. Not well, but he is an extraordinarily distinguished diplomat. He is roughly half a generation older than I am, so that he served in South Africa, I want to say 8 or 9 years before I got there. The first point, I think, about Ed Perkins as ambassador to South Africa was exactly who he was. The apartheid government in South Africa was never stupid. And the result was it responded to Ambassador Perkins with the same dignity that it would respond to any American ambassador. Ambassador Perkins is dignified, thoughtful, and highly articulate. That means simply by being in South Africa, by being a public figure in South Africa, he contributed to the change in perception that particularly supporters of apartheid had about what people of African descent could do. Well, essentially, the ambassador, any ambassador, is the president's personal representative to the head of state. But the ambassador is also, in effect, the CEO of an embassy, which can be a very large operation. Between the embassy in Abuja and the consulate in Lagos, there were somewhere between 200 and 300 Americans, and probably more than 1,000 Nigerians. So, among other things, it's a big management job. Further, there are multiple agencies at any embassy. If I recall correctly, in Abuja at the time, we had 17. Now, the ambassador, as the president's personal representative, in fact, is the head of all of those agencies with respect to their operations in the host country. That means there is a coordinating role, also a leadership role, and also a role in shaping the overall approach, the overall American approach to the host country. The ambassador in any country is also the most prominent public face of the United States. That means he has, or she has, an extremely important public diplomacy role. At the particular time I was ambassador to Nigeria, it was the run-up to elections in 2007. So I was able to use the position of ambassador as a kind of bully pulpit to talk about the importance of free, fair, and credible elections. to talk about the importance of a loyal opposition. The other great advantage to being ambassador in a friendly country like Nigeria is that, in fact, you get a lot of press coverage. So your message can actually be gotten out there. Whether the message is specifically political, such as talking about elections, or whether it's more broadly social, for example, talking about the rights of women, or alternatively the damage caused by human trafficking. The list goes on and on. But that public dimension to what an ambassador does is very important. Well, at the time, our interests were probably greater in Nigeria than in any other African country. At that time, Nigeria was producing about 2 million barrels of oil a day and exporting about 1 million barrels a day to the United States. Further, Nigerian production continued even during periods of crisis in the Middle East, so it was an assured source of petroleum. Secondly, the government of Nigeria under President Olusegun Obasanjo was very outward-looking, deeply involved in institutions like the African Union or the Economic Community of West African States, and pursued a democracy agenda, for example, opposition to military coups. Nigeria played an extremely positive role with respect to ending civil war in Sierra Leone or in Liberia. And Nigeria was one of the largest contributors of peacekeepers to UN and AU peacekeeping missions, very often in places where it was quite impossible for the United States to fulfill that role. Further, in those days, Nigeria had democratic aspirations, and as by far the largest country in Africa, it had an impact on how other Africans looked at the process of democratization. In terms of personal danger, no, none whatsoever. In terms of tenseness, yes. There was the insurrection in the Niger Delta, in which the insurgents were attacking oil infrastructure, some of which was owned by American companies. Then there was the effort by the then president of Nigeria to amend the Constitution so that he could run for a third term. This was bitterly divisive in the Nigerian body politic, and eventually he stood down. U.S. policy at that time was really quite clear. U.S. policy was to support term limits as opening up the space for democratic development. I was in the department at the time. I was dean of the language school at the Foreign Service Institute. And yes, I recall very well the horror. I also recall very well the absolutely superb leadership exercised by our ambassadors in both Kenya and Tanzania. But not just the ambassadors. This leadership went right down through the Foreign Service ranks. It was not militarized when I was there. Yes, it was a concern. We knew about Mohammed Yusuf's what should we call it, commune at the Railroad Mosque in Maiduguri. We knew of its existence. We had no contact with it because, of course, they would not talk to us. But an extremely important point is that in those days, they were essentially peaceful. They were not altogether peaceful, and we now know that, in fact, they were responsible for certain murders, but individual murders, not mass murders, as it is now. And at the time, we did not know that they were the ones responsible for it. Yes, it was of concern, but not a major concern. It would be rather slotted into our general concern about the rise of Islamic radicalism in northern Nigeria. As ambassador, I was particularly concerned that the embassy reach out to Nigeria's Muslim population. And in fact, we did a number of practical and concrete things to advance that agenda. For example, I got the Library of Congress to send some experts to Nigeria to look at ancient Islamic manuscripts in the north, give advice on their preservation, and also photograph them so that they would be available to scholars, but always leaving them in place. Or we bought a group of American imams, all from Southern California, to Nigeria to interact with Nigerian imams. We would also do photographic exhibitions on mosques in the United States. The whole idea being to make Nigerians aware that there was a vibrant, dynamic Islamic population in the United States that was thoroughly American. Sometimes, too, embassy officers could come up with absolutely brilliant initiatives. A group of them, for example, got together and put on an end of Ramadan dinner at a local mosque in Abuja. What was so successful about this effort was not that they provided the food, but rather they did the serving and the cleanup themselves. The notion that American diplomats were serving food to ordinary Nigerians and then cleaning up when the dinner was over, that's the kind of thing that works like yeast in dough. It has a much broader impact than the actual event itself would indicate. My greatest accomplishment as a U.S. diplomat, put in broadest terms, I think I may have broadened and deepened the understanding of host country people about what the United States is, its diversity, and its fundamental commitment to human rights and to democracy. America's greatest diplomatic accomplishment in Nigeria, I think, has been, and it's ongoing, our open support for the process of democratization and human rights. I would argue that the diplomatic function has been underfunded since the days of President Reagan, particularly acute following the decision to open, 16, 17 new embassies after the Soviet Union dissolved, but without requesting any additional personnel or any additional funding. I would suggest that the diplomatic function is still never recovered from that. There are too few diplomats. When I got to the embassy in Abuja in 2004, almost a third of the positions were vacant. We eventually got them filled, in part because of my own recruiting efforts. But in that huge embassy, at that time either the largest in Africa or one of the 2 or 3 largest, there were a total of 3 senior officers, of which I was one. So too few, too junior, and because too few, it meant that the officers that were there were inexperienced and often had not had the training that was to have been hoped for. Secretary Powell, in my view, with Secretary Shultz, the 2 most successful secretaries of state while I was in the Foreign Service. Secretary Powell was dedicated to greatly improving the training regimen within the Foreign Service. And in fact, he even won support from the Congress for it. Unfortunately, those initiatives went aground because of the demands of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. What I would like to do is put it in a somewhat larger context. Americans have struggled with what an American diplomatic service should be, what it should look like. In the late 18th and in the 19th centuries, it was basically made up of wealthy individuals because essentially the salaries were too low to support anybody without private means, or alternatively, particularly with respect to consular affairs, diplomats were compensated essentially by the fees that they collected. So the transformation of this rather ad hoc and extremely limited service into something where there were uniform professional requirements has been an ongoing effort. There is, and I don't think we should beat around the bush, there continues to be tension between career Foreign Service officers, and particularly ambassadors who come out of the career service, and political appointees. From my perspective, political appointees too often rather resemble 19th century British military officers who purchased their commissions without any particular knowledge of the requirements of the job. This goes back to a point that I made earlier. An ambassador is more than just a diplomat. An ambassador has to lead a very large community. There must be not only country-specific knowledge of how you do diplomacy, but there also has to be knowledge about how you lead people and get them to do their very best work. These are not skills that are necessarily readily available on the street. Boko Haram is a lot of things, and it's very difficult to get your arms around it. Amongst other things, it is a radical Islamist insurrection against the Nigerian political economy. It's centered in a part of the country which has been, to a remarkable extent, ignored by the government in Abuja, and it's one of the poorest parts of the world. So it's that. It's also a criminal conspiracy, and it may have or be morphing into cultish elements. I'm thinking particularly of the gruesome murders, which are associated sometimes with African cults. The Nigerian government's perspective is that it's terrorism, plain and simple, and that Boko Haram is a part of al-Qaeda, essentially. I think that's way oversimplified. I think Boko Haram has a popular dimension to it, and the Nigerian government is, in my view, short-sighted in not pursuing a counterinsurgency as opposed to counterterrorism approach. As for what the U.S. government is doing, Boko Haram is an internal matter at present. The Obama administration offered resources to try to locate the some 300 schoolgirls that were kidnapped by Boko Haram from Chibok in Borno State. This is surveillance. Hasn't gone much beyond that. Hasn't gone beyond that at all, as a matter of fact. And the girls still have not been located. I think we have to be very careful. The Chinese are not 10 feet tall. And in fact, the Chinese presence in Nigeria also does not lend itself to being viewed as a stereotype. There has, for example, been a Chinese community in Nigeria from Hong Kong and also from Taiwan since the late colonial period. Companies that are associated with the government in Beijing are particularly interested in infrastructure projects, restoration, for example, of the Nigerian railways. But the Chinese have got a big public relations problem in Nigeria. They are not widely liked. The Chinese are seen as isolating themselves from Nigerian people, and above all, not making use of Nigerians to work on projects. So, for example, the Chinese will import, say, ditch diggers from China as opposed to making use of local people to dig ditches. But again, we give very little military support. In other words, Nigeria receives very little military support from anybody. Here I think you have to be very careful, and you have to ask yourself what the statement, Africa is the home of the six of the 10 fastest growing economies. There is a very good book by Morton Jervin called Poor Numbers, which essentially demolishes the statistics that those kinds of statements are based on. What I think you have to do is you have to move away from a generalization about Africa and instead look at specific countries. South Africa is doing extremely well. So is Namibia. So is Botswana. So is Senegal. So is Zambia. Eastern Congo, Kenya, northern Nigeria, the picture is really very different. Well, what I would say is if you're asking what is the biggest block to further economic development in Africa, it's governance. It's governance and the rule of law. Once you have good governance conducted according to the rule of law, such as you have in South Africa, then there are any number of different development strategies that will work very well. Absent good government and the rule of law, no matter how good the strategy is, you're not going to get very far. I don't think it's changed it to any significant degree. What it's done is expanded it. It's growing. What is an interesting development is that in South Africa, the South African government is in the process of taking over the funding of PEPFAR. In other words, assuming responsibility for PEPFAR. This is an altogether positive development. PEPFAR is an interagency strategy based on a partnership with host governments, making use of NGOs and ministries of health to deliver treatment, but also to deliver education to the host country population. In general, the treatment dimension appears to have been the more successful. And in fact, in some countries, the victims of HIV/AIDS now are able to live essentially a normal lifespan. The issue is, how do you coordinate between a U.S. government and a host nation government, particularly on issues of procurement and accountability? After all, the administration has to account to the Congress for every penny that it spends on PEPFAR. This requires a degree of accountability which is often something new for African institutions. Basically, just before the Civil War, 20 years or so before the Civil War, they were often authors who were quite popular in the United States, and it was a way to not only to ensure that they were able to earn a living, but it also, as it were, was putting our best foot forward. No, not really. However, I have been, on occasion, totally wrong. For example, I was convinced that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, and that, therefore, the Bush administration's justification for the war in Iraq was sound. That clearly was wrong. No. And that is because I was never authorized by the State Department to raise with the president term limits. However, our policy on term limits was quite clear, so that I made those points essentially by indirection in public statements. Let me give you a specific example. One of the rules is that you can hold a National Day reception either on the 4th of July or on President's Day in February. And often that decision is made on the basis of climate. I moved the 4th of July reception to President's Day because in my formal remarks, I was able to talk about George Washington. And I talked about how George Washington, the great national hero at the time, declined to run for a third term. The Nigerian audience got it perfectly well. There was a kind of an initial gasp and then very strong applause, because the third term idea was extremely unpopular. It was extremely important. And actually, his role was multifaceted. It's often forgotten that, in fact, he was a diplomat representing the colony of Pennsylvania and I think also New Jersey in the early 1770s in London, where he essentially tried to get the ministry to back off on the issues that eventually led to the Declaration of Independence. And then, of course, his career in Paris is extremely well known, where he played an important role in bringing the French in on our side. And I would point out that absent the French, we would have almost certainly been unsuccessful.